My name is Lisa, and I want to share a story that changed my life. Some might judge me for how everything unfolded, but I hope someone out there will understand. I need to share this to let go of the past and come to terms with the fact that everything happened the way it was meant to. At the time of this story, I had been living with my boyfriend for nearly 2 years. We rented a small apartment in a building with dozens of similar units. Our life was simple and, in a way, monotonous. We had grown so used to each other that I sometimes felt we were just roommates sharing a space rather than two people who once loved each other. My one true joy was my dog, a Labrador named Bella. She had been with me long before I met my boyfriend, and I always said she was my most loyal friend. Bella was incredibly smart, but also had a stubborn streak. She had a peculiar habit of snatching things and bringing them to me, as if presenting me with some sort of prize. I couldn't help but laugh every time she proudly trotted over, holding her latest trophy in her mouth. That day, I came home from work feeling a little tired. As usual, my boyfriend wasn't home. That had become normal. He was often busy with his life, his friends, his plans, most of which he didn't even bother telling me about. I had stopped asking questions a long time ago. Bella greeted me at the door, tail wagging enthusiastically. This time, her trophy was a pair of men's sneakers. I immediately noticed they weren't ours. The sneakers were fairly simple, a little worn, but still in good condition. I was puzzled. There was no way they could have appeared in our apartment on their own. Bella must have dragged them in from the hallway or somewhere else. I scolded her gently, but honestly, I found it amusing. She looked so proud of herself, as if she'd accomplished something remarkable. I placed the sneakers on the shelf near the door, deciding I'd deal with them later, but I couldn't stop wondering where they had come from. The most logical explanation was that they belonged to one of our neighbors. The next day, I decided to return them. Though I felt a little awkward, I knocked on the door of the neighbor who I thought might own them. I had no idea that this simple act would mark the beginning of something entirely new. When I handed the sneakers back to their owner, he thanked me and said something like, "How strange that they ended up with your dog." I smiled and replied that Bella had a knack for finding treasures. The conversation was brief, but for some reason I kept thinking about it that evening. Maybe it was because my boyfriend didn't even notice how my day had gone. Or maybe it was because there was something pleasant about that brief encounter. After that, Bella seemed determined to bring me more trophies. Sometimes it was a single sock, other times a shoelace. But curiously, the items were always men's things, and they were never ours. I told myself it was just a coincidence. It was Bella, after all, who brought the items, not me. Still, every time I returned another find, I found myself enjoying the interaction. I liked talking to him, the neighbor. He smiled genuinely and listened to me, unlike my boyfriend, who had a habit of nodding absent-mindedly. I liked feeling noticed, even if only for a moment. Bella's adventures continued. One day, she even managed to drag home a sports glove. It was bizarre and a little funny, but I kept wondering how she was managing to do it. Sometimes it was a lone sock, other times a tangled shoelace. Yet all of it seemed to belong to the same person. Every time I returned the items, I saw that same kind smile in his eyes. No matter how awkward the situation was, he found a way to make it light and pleasant. My life at that time felt dull. Work, small household tasks, walking the dog, and occasionally attempting to have conversations with my boyfriend. Conversations that often ended before they even began. He was rarely home, and when he was, his face was buried in his phone or occupied with something else. I couldn't even remember the last time he looked at me the way my neighbor did when I brought back his belongings. Bella didn't stop her escapades. She seemed like she was carrying out a grand plan known only to her. Each time she brought me something, I felt a strange mix of amusement and anticipation. I couldn't deny that I looked forward to returning the items. It wasn't about the things themselves. It was about the feeling I had during those brief interactions. He was kind and attentive. Even in short conversations, I felt like he genuinely wanted to hear me. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. My boyfriend, on the other hand, seemed indifferent. He no longer cared how I looked, what I felt, or what was happening in my life. The emptiness between us had become unbearable. One evening, while reading a book, I heard a faint noise. Bella was sitting by the door, and next to her lay a pair of men's shorts. My heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be a coincidence anymore. Bella had been indoors all day. I hadn't let her out. I stared at the shorts for a long time, unsure of what to do. I felt embarrassed, but also strangely compelled to return them. When I knocked on his door, holding the shorts, he opened it with a barely contained smile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed everything that had happened over the past few weeks in my mind. Were these just coincidences? Or did they mean something? The more I thought about what was happening, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a string of coincidences. Yet, I couldn't explain it. How could my dog keep bringing items from the same apartment when I hadn't even let her out alone? With every new find, I felt more unsettled. Not in a bad way. In fact, quite the opposite. Each time I returned one of those items, I felt like I was part of a script, playing a role in a story without knowing how it would end. These encounters with my neighbor had become more than just polite exchanges of words. They were brief, yes, but those fleeting moments brought something new into my life. I realized I wasn't coming home from work hoping to see my boyfriend anymore. Instead, I found myself waiting for Bella to bring me another mystery item, for her to create another reason for me to knock on that door. Everything changed on what seemed like an ordinary day. Bella brought back another item, this time an old sports jersey. I wasn't surprised anymore, but something stopped me from returning it right away. I sat there, holding the jersey in my hands, trying to decipher my emotions. A feeling grew inside me, a sense that this was deliberate. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't shake the thought. And the strangest part was, I liked it. I knew I needed to talk to my neighbor. When I returned the jersey, I paid close attention to his reaction. He smiled, as always, and said something like, "Looks like your dog's been at it again." But this time I couldn't just walk away. I needed answers. On my way back home, my thoughts raced. My relationship with my boyfriend had become so hollow that I barely noticed how the days passed. We lived side by side, but we were drifting further apart. He didn't care about my day, my feelings, or my dreams. And with this man, this neighbor, who had somehow become a part of my life, I felt something entirely different. That evening, I took Bella on a long walk, hoping to clear my head. I needed to understand what was happening inside me. I couldn't ignore the way each interaction with my neighbor awakened something forgotten. It was something I hadn't felt in ages: interest, attention, lightness. Even so, I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that it couldn't be serious, that it would stay nothing more than a series of amusing coincidences. But the next find forced me to act. It was a shoelace, just one. I sat with it in my hands, looking at Bella, who stared back at me with a look of triumph, as if she'd just completed an important mission. "You're too clever, aren't you, girl?" I thought. This time, I decided not to simply return the item. I needed to talk to my neighbor to figure out how this was even possible. I grabbed the shoelace and walked to his door. When he opened it, I looked at him and asked, "How is my dog bringing your things if she never goes out on her own?" He smiled faintly, as if he'd been waiting for this question. Then, calmly, he said, "I suppose it's time to come clean." I froze. My suspicions were right, but I still couldn't grasp what he meant. He explained that ever since he first saw me in the building, he had wanted to get to know me. But he didn't know how to approach me. He thought I seemed too busy or maybe too closed off for small talk. One day, he noticed Bella wandering near the entrance and decided to use her as a bridge between us. Every item Bella brought had been staged. He left them out, knowing she'd be curious enough to grab them. "I just wanted to find a way to talk to you without overstepping," he said. I stood there trying to process his words. It sounded unbelievable. For a moment, I felt a flicker of anger. How dare he use my dog to orchestrate this? But at the same time, I felt something entirely different. This man had spent so much time and effort just to find a way to connect with me. He observed, he waited, he even studied my dog's habits to craft this intricate plan. I didn't know what to say. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. On one hand, I was shocked, but on the other, I began to see his actions in a different light. It was something my boyfriend had never done. He had never gone out of his way for me. He had never looked at me the way this man did. Over time, I realized that his actions came from a place of genuine care. He didn't just want to meet me. He wanted to understand me, to be close to me. This truth changed everything. I started to see our coincidental encounters differently. They weren't random. They were part of a plan, one that had seemed chaotic at first, but was, in fact, surprisingly thoughtful. I couldn't ignore my feelings anymore. It felt good to know that someone was willing to try so hard for me. That was when I started to realize my current relationship had no future. My life with my boyfriend had become a habit, devoid of love. I couldn't deny that with my neighbor, I felt something entirely different. It was honest, open, and real. After that conversation, I couldn't calm down. Part of me felt a flicker of anger. Who was he to interfere in my life, even through my dog? But that thought quickly faded. Everything else inside me screamed that this was something different. This was the action of someone who truly saw me. Someone who noticed me in a way no one else had in a long time. I began to think more about my life. My relationship with my boyfriend, which had once seemed so right, now felt gray and lifeless. We didn't talk anymore. Not really. He didn't care about what was happening in my life, and I cared less and less about where he went or why he stayed out late. We simply existed side by side, and I realized he was no longer my partner. But how do you change everything? How do you find the words to say it out loud? One evening, after an especially long and lonely day, I made up my mind. We were sitting in the living room. I was scrolling through my phone, and he was watching some series. I turned to him and realized I had to be honest. I told him I wasn't happy anymore, that our relationship had become nothing more than a habit. He looked at me, not fully grasping what I was saying at first. When it finally clicked, he responded that he hadn't thought there was a problem, that he thought everything was fine. Those words confirmed for me, once and for all, that we couldn't go on. He hadn't even noticed how unhappy I was. We talked calmly, without yelling. He agreed that maybe we really should go our separate ways. After he left, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't fear of being alone or guilt. It was lightness. as if I had finally done something important for myself. My neighbor didn't find out about it right away. We kept crossing paths, walking Bella, talking about small, everyday things. But in those conversations, I started to see how he treated me. He looked at me with interest, with a kind of attention I hadn't felt in so long. One evening, while I was out walking Bella, he joined us. We talked about dogs, about how he had once wanted a Labrador, but never quite went through with it. He joked, and I found myself realizing how alive I felt when I was around him. Later, as we returned to the building, he looked at me and said, "I'm glad I got the chance to meet you, even if it happened a bit unconventionally." I smiled. That was the moment I realized I wanted to get to know him better. We started spending more time together. He was always there, whether I needed help or just company. And with every passing day, I grew more certain that I had made the right decision by ending my previous relationship. He told me that he had noticed me a long time ago, but hadn't known how to approach me. His idea with the items had been a sort of experiment. He hadn't expected it to go as far as it did, but he was glad it had worked out. A few months later, our relationship became official. We moved in together, and it was a completely different experience. With him, I felt important, loved, and valued. He cared for me in ways no one ever had before. A year later, we got married. Now, we have 2 children, and Bella is still by our side. Every time we think back to how we met, we laugh. That story has become a part of us, the beginning of everything real and meaningful. I don't regret what happened. Sometimes, to find your happiness, you have to let go of what no longer brings you joy. And I'm grateful I had the courage to do it.